Well, as South Africans wait in anticipation for Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's speech, they're hoping there won't be any tax increases. Now, in his last budget speech, former Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba increased VAT by 1%. Of course, we'll never forget that, to 15%. This dug deeper into the wallets of already strained South Africans. So what can we expect this year? SAICA's Peter Faber joins us now in studio. Thanks again, Peter, for coming into studio.
Thank you very much.
You and I, as we were counting down to this interview, we sort of exhaled, and there is that sense of, you know, what is to come. There's so much that we are expecting as ordinary South Africans to hear about some relief for our own pockets, but also for the country's SOEs, Eskom in particular. How are you feeling on this budget day?
Well, I think we're all on the same page as what today. When you talk about the man on the street, I think there's two constituencies. The one is on the income side. People are saying, but I don't want to pay more tax. I'm already drowning in debt, and etc. And on the other side, on the expenditure side, if you look at people who are looking at social grants, they're saying, but how much more am I going to be able to get to buy what I need every day? So those two concerns are, call it opposing concerns, but both the people on the street as to concerns what's going to happen in this budget, whether you maintain taxes or increase taxes or cut expenditure on the other side. As to the SOEs, I think that's an important part of this budget and a big focus as to how much money needs to be allocated from this budget. And I think a concern we've consistently raised, especially in Parliament, is that even though, for example, on the guarantees, we've guaranteed various things, we're not quite clear what is actually guaranteed or security, or what are the things that the budget actually needs to allocate to pay for.
Yeah.
And that goes down beyond SOEs, even to local government, as we've seen where municipalities' sewage works implodes and it has no budget. National government needs to step in and it needs to fund that. So that is a big concern, is that these unknown quantities or liabilities that lie in various aspects of the economy is a further drain on the fiscus, in that we can't just give guarantees, we actually have to expend cash to cover these scenarios.
And the thing is, we actually don't have that kind of cash just lying around. I mean, tax collections are falling, and as you say, government spending increasing exponentially.
Yes, I think over the last 10 plus years, 20 years, we've seen government expenditure, some people use the word explosion, but it's gone quite high. For this year, we might see a tapering off. Our estimations, even though it's very difficult to estimate the expenditure side, seems to be that government has tapered off on the cash flows on the expenditure side. So we don't expect them to exceed at least the budgeted expenditure, which is a good start. But we do, and I think that's the message, start living within our means. If you're starting to borrow money to pay for operating expenditure like salaries, etc., or borrowing money to pay debt, like with your normal household budget, you're starting to get into trouble.
I mean, in terms of cutting government expenditure, we've talked about this issue around the bloated cabinet over and over again. But aside from cutting down on deputy ministers and some ministries themselves, where else can we cut that excess fat?
Well, if you look at the biggest expenditure item, and that's probably the most controversial, is the salary budget. So if on the salary budget, it's just over 35% of expenditure, but more importantly, it's nearing to 50% of income. So remember, the difference is actually funded out of debt, because that contributes. So if we're only receiving 10 Rand in income, we're nearly spending 5 Rand of it just on salaries. And the question is, where have we gone? So if you look at a comparison of salaries as a percentage of GDP, South Africa is sitting just about nearly on just under 15%. If you compare that to like the OECD, they're under 10%. Turkey is at about 7-8%. So even in emerging markets, it's below 10% of GDP. So South Africa is quite an outlier, even compared to both developed and developing countries. Yeah. The problem with that one, in a downsizing economy, and the question was posed in Parliament by the chair of the Standing Committee, is to say, but let's say we assume government needs to slash 300,000 jobs. If you don't have an economy to absorb them, you're just compounding the problem, because government is still going to have to allocate money to look after these people in any way. And I think that transition arrangement is where we need policy to say we need to transition to a lower wage bill, but it's going to be a transition, and what is that transition going to be, and how does the private sector absorb everybody who's coming out of the public sector?
All right, so let's talk about that issue around unemployment figures. I mean, our unemployment numbers are scary, to say the least. 27%, most of them young people in the prime of their lives, unable to find work. What are we expecting to hear, just in terms of perhaps support for SMMEs, which is where government repeatedly says most of these employment opportunities should come from?
Yeah, I think importantly that is an important question as to focus. Do we have policy alignment to a large extent? If we're saying that SMEs are the generator, and just on the unemployment, that's the unemployment excluding the people who have given up. The actual employment rate is actually closer to 37%. And I think it's something a bit of a misnomer to use the 27%.
So those are just people who are actively looking for work.
Correct.
Yeah.
You actually need to include the other people who have stopped looking for work because they're still unemployed. You still need to look after them. As to focus, yes, we need policy focus. If we're going to say that SMEs are the focus as to where we need, is our education system geared for it? Is funding available? Is assistance available? And is the priorities within all government departments, etc., set up in the economy? Because historically, our economy was based on a large employer, large business, whether it was mining, financial services now. It is based on, that's why we end up with 80% of income coming from 20% of companies. Yeah. And that's a very big structural change. And there's also quite a, in my mind, a conflation in that big companies tend to produce pro rata more profits or taxes. Smaller companies provide more employment. So that is some of the priorities we need to understand when we have this discussion on focus on small business.
So as we wrap up our interview, Peter, how closely will Moodys be keeping an eye on what Tito Mboweni has to say today in making that decision on whether to finally consign us to full-blown junk status?
Well, to a large extent, I think, as you noted, the SOE. So have we really put, and I think for the last few years we've been talking, a lot of people have been talking about what they termed, I think Professor Janus talked about a fiscal cliff. Yeah. We've now come to a crossroads, the kicking down of the can and hoping that we can do something or that the economy will change. I think that discussion is over. I think as we've seen, the rest of the world and emerging economies have recovered, our economy hasn't. And it's not because of the world economy anymore, it's because of what we do locally. And we now have to get into that mode of solutioning and saying we can't defer this anymore, and Moodys will be looking at our ability to pay debt. Are we restructuring what we're doing to not pay it with debt? So if we are saying that our economy is going to grow, in the interim, are we going to finance that out of debt or out of our own means? And if we do finance it out of our own means, I think it will be more positive, even though it will be very restrictive. We saw that comment last year from Treasury saying that if we don't finance out of debt, we will restrict our economy. Unfortunately, that's what we're going to do. If we learn from places like Ireland and even Greece that's now gone through this process, sometimes you're going to have to go through this bad period of cutting expenditure in your economy so that you can get the fundamentals right.
Yeah, it sounds like the finance minister will have to pull a rabbit out of a hat this afternoon.
He's going to have a tough job.
Thanks very much for coming into studio.
Thank you very much.
Peter Faber is from the SA Institute of Chartered Accountants as we continue to unpack exactly what we are hoping to hear from Tito Mboweni's maiden budget speech at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So as Peter